Thank you, Mr. Ting. I want to thank everyone for sharing, how LCFF is being implemented in very different communities, going forward, I guess I'm just concerned now that we are giving more decision-making authority to local school boards and local superintendents. It seems like we want to make sure that we have this, good governance at the local level so that we can make LCFF work. And so my concern is that, while the LAO explained this multi-layered system of accountability, starting with parental involvement and transparency and parents monitoring what's going on at the school district, you're describing the realities where you can't even get people out to a football game. If people aren't going to come out to a football game, are they going to go to a school board meeting? When you have population serving a large number of migrant farm workers, are they going to come to a school board meeting? Those are the concerns that I have in terms of trying to make sure that we can make LCFF successful, and along those lines, I appreciate Dr. Miller your comment about how we don't want to just resort back to the familiar, and you want to open it up to parents, to students, to explore what are the most effective ways of reaching these populations. But what I heard, was very few specific examples of the kind of services that are going to help the low-income students, that are going to help the English learner students, that are going to help the foster youth. What I heard was more of an emphasis on the parental involvement in the student outreach and the outreach and planning process. And I know, again, this is the first year of LCFF, and that's a part of that. But do any of you have any comments on how can we ensure that we get the system right so that we can make LCFF work with better governance at the local level?
Can I clarify?
Yes.
I think as we have messed with the process, we keep discovering things, and we, like everybody up here talks about, we spent meetings and weeks looking at this, and then you'll make new discoveries. And part of it is the more we looked at LCAP, we understood that that was about defining the accountability. There's another step that we've got to go figure out the budget and the solutions to get to that accountability. So if this is the new metric, whatever it is, that needs to be defined by the local community, now there's what I'll call a professional obligation to go back and say, what's the high leverage kinds of activities that we could use to actually get to that? And so that's a coming piece once we better understand the first part. And that's not a random activity. That's going to have to be very specific, and it's going to have to be leveraged. It's going to have to be prioritized of what can we do this year, what can we do the second year, what can we do the third year. And again, we will be measured not on the hows, but we will be measured on the outcome, which again, I think that's a real system shift for where we've been. It's the right system shift overall. But that's, I don't think I described that clearly enough when we talked about that.
No, I heard you say that, and thank you for the clarification.
One kind of comment, Mr. Mirasucci, is, and you talk about, Dr. Miller talked about the football game. I don't think it's an issue of the number of people that participate. I think it's an issue of the different groups that participate. And in our case, Dr. Mannon has a parent advisory group. It's a very small group, but it represents every one of the different, whether it's the free and reduced, whether it's a limited English, whether it's a foster, and actually PTA is on there. But again, I think I'm sure in their communities, the same as it is in Torrance, we have some very active parents, very active community members. There's not a lot of, it's not a large number like for a big football game, but there are enough of them that they're bringing their thoughts, we're listening to their comments, and we're utilizing those in the development of the LCAP.
All right.
I can share with you some of those ideas that you're asking about, because this is what we currently do, and this is what our parents have asked us to keep. We have what's known in our K-8 school a focus block. That focus block looks at robotics, ELD instruction. It looks at student interventions for both English, language arts, mathematics, and it also looks at providing a high-level stimulus for those students who are at grade level. We look at the students every 6 weeks. We do an assessment, and then we regroup them. So if you're not tied to a certain area, that's one thing that we do. We also look at academic vocabulary. For the last 3 years, we have studied and looked at research that indicates if we gear up the academic vocabulary for all our students, especially our English language learners, they will be successful. We also looked at whole brain teaching. That is a classroom discipline management that teaches all students when a teacher wants their attention and how we go about getting them focused on instruction. At our high school level, we also have hands-on science projects that work for all students. Being small, I'm allowed and have an opportunity to go into all classrooms. The students know who I am because I've also been superintendent and principal at one point in my 7 years. So I can go to the elementary school, the K-8 school. I go to our continuation school to ensure that we're actually putting to practice those things that engage students, because it does us no good as administrators and as educators if we have a beautiful lesson going on but students are not engaged. I think Carolyn Downing, in her 5-minute or 3-minute classroom visits, earmarked for me as an administrator, I can go into a classroom and see, are students engaged? Or is the teacher up there and all you hear is blah, 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 which is the Charlie Brown.
All right. Seeing no further questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we will move then to we'd like to invite our third panel, representative from the Department of Finance, and also invite back the LAO and the Department of Education to discuss the governor's 2014-2015 proposal for the local control funding formula implementation funding.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Lori Carney from Department of Finance, and I'm happy to present to you the Governor's proposal for funding the implementation of the local control funding formula for 14-15. Thanks to increased revenues from Proposition 30 and California's recovering economy, the Governor's budget makes a significant investment in K-12 education, with LCFF implementation being among the highest priority. Specifically, the Governor's budget provides $4.5 billion in Proposition 98 General Fund towards closing the gap between current funding and the target level of funding LEAs will receive upon full implementation of LCFF. This $4.5 billion will close about 28% of the 14-15 funding gap for each school district and charter school. In addition, $25.9 million will close the entire gap for county offices of education. I also want to note some related proposals that are in the governor's budget. All remaining deferral debt will be retired. Funding for the specialized secondary and agricultural vocational education programs will be transferred to the LCFF and provided to districts that currently receive these categorical funds. And as you mentioned, that issue will be heard on April 1st in this committee. And last, the basic aid fair share calculation would be adjusted to account for one-time RDA, ensuring that no district receives less than it did in 2012-13. I'll keep it brief, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right, thank you. Why don't we move on to the LAO?
Sure. So Carolyn Chu with the LAO. So our recommendation regarding the funding level for the LCFF is that dedicating virtually all of the new and ongoing funding under Proposition 98 is consistent with the implementation plan for the local control funding formula.
All right. CD.
Monique Ramos on behalf of Superintendent Torlakson. I don't want to be repetitive of the superintendent's remarks from last week, so I'll just say that the superintendent is in support of the governor's proposal to provide $4.5 billion in Prop 98 for local control funding formula.
Okay, thank you. Let me start off with the Department of Finance. You indicated that the governor's plan is to fully fund LCFF over 8 years. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And but in the meantime, you heard some of our local school districts talk about how, there are still, their first, in many cases, many school districts' first priority is to try to restore funding to get back to the pre-recession level. Is the administration's timeline for the full implementation, is this a realistic timeline given the immediate challenges that our districts are facing in terms of restoring a lot of the cuts that have been made during the Great Recession?
Right. We do believe, based on our current Proposition 98 estimates, that the 8-year implementation timeline is the most realistic at this point. Our Proposition 98 estimates are just that, estimates. Mm-hmm. Things could change in the future. I would note that we are seeing, because of Proposition 30 in part, significant increases in the near-term years, and so we're putting we're closing the gap a little more quickly in the next few years, and then that'll level off a little bit more, so hopefully districts will be able to make greater strides towards reaching their full implementation a little bit sooner, and then again tapering off, but still increasing in the out years.
Does the LAO agree with the administration's assessment that this timeline for the full implementation of the LCFF is whether it's realistic?
So we do not have estimates that go out to 2021, which is the year that the governor estimates we would be fully implemented for the formula. Our estimates go out to 1 year before that, 2019, 2020. Our estimate for that year is that we could be 90% of the way there to full implementation by that year.
All right. And finally, for my end, I started off this hearing by, reminding folks that we can't lose sight of the bigger picture, that we need to increase funding for all students in the state of California. And does the governor have a plan to address the fact that California is 49th in the nation in per pupil spending?
Sure. Chris Ferguson with the Department of Finance. We would say that the local control funding formula is the distributional methodology for distributing funds, but it is not intended to address any particular funding concerns. We would note, though, that the funding formula itself does represent a substantial reinvestment into education over the next 8 years.
So the LCFF, as you indicate, is the distributional solution, but does the governor have a plan for making that pie bigger rather than proposing how to cut the pie?
At this time, the governor's budget would just reflect the administration's priorities. In terms of a long-term projection, it does not do that at this time.
All right. Any other questions from the committee? All right. Seeing none, thank you very much. We will move on to our next panel. Oh, yes, you are the next panel. We have...
You're stuck with us.
So, Kenneth Capon? No. Oh. Oh, yes. So we are on the subject of the creating of the automatic formula for the LCFF funding. Let's start with finance.
Okay. Again, Lori Carney with Finance. Related to the implementation of the LCFF, the administration proposes to create a continuous appropriation for LCFF implementation funding, ensuring that the formula is implemented on schedule in future years. As your agenda describes, the current continuous appropriation mechanism provides districts their prior year funding amount adjusted for changes in ADA, even without an approved state budget in place. Similarly, our proposal is to continuously appropriate a certain percentage of Proposition 98 that would not only fund a district's prior year base and changes in ADA caseload, but would also automate the amount districts receive for their gap funding, that difference that we've discussed between their prior year funding level and their target LCFF funding level. So specifically, we propose that 76% of Proposition 98 would be continuously appropriated in 2014-15, and that 79% would be continuously appropriated each year thereafter until full implementation of LCFF. I'll note here that during LCFF implementation, the COLA factor is applied to districts' target funding levels. That would not change under our continuous appropriation proposal. After full implementation, the continuous appropriation will work as it did under revenue limits, and COLA would be subject to a Budget Act appropriation. We feel that the continuous appropriation would provide districts predictability and certainty that they will get closer to their target funding each year. It ensures that districts will be held harmless, that they will not receive less funding than they received in 2012-13.
All right. LAO, what do you think of this proposal?
We recommend rejecting the governor's proposal for the continuous appropriation. The proposal would limit the legislature's discretion with how to allocate funding within Proposition 98 each year. Moreover, regarding the issue of certainty, the LCFF already continuously appropriates the LCFF funding levels from the prior year. So absent a budget act for 2014-15, districts would receive what they received in 2013-14 without any action. So there is already some level of certainty for what districts would receive year to year. So overall, our recommendation is to reject the proposal.
Thank you. And Ms. Ramos.
We appreciate the goals of the governor is seeking to achieve through this proposal, providing greater certainty for LEAs as they try to plan for their budget for multi-years. However, we have both policy and technical concerns with the proposal. This proposal relies on projections of Prop 98 funding, which have proven very volatile over the last several years. It's not clear that this would be an improvement over the current situation and may even create more uncertainty. Currently, for multi-year budgeting, LEAs have the guaranteed floor funding and projection of two factors: the percentage in the gap funding that will be funded in future years and percentage of COLA. These projections are firm. These projections are as firm as they would be available under the governor's proposal, and set the percentage of the projected Prop 98 funding level. But the legislature always has the authority to go in and change that by potentially suspending Prop 98 or failing to fund the COLA. In addition, the current structure of appropriating gap annually is easier for LEAs to use in actual budgeting. Even though the existing gap percentage is not known by LEAs, the LEA is able to estimate for budgeting purposes much more easily than it would be able to translate under statewide Prop 98 and LCFF budgeting. We'd also like to note that the amount at stake here is relatively small. The total funding LEAs receive with their floor funding is the majority of the funding they will receive for the following year. While we do have technical concerns that are complex, we've been working with Department of Finance on those concerns and would request that if this proposal is adopted by the committee, that we work with Finance to address those.
All right. Questions? I'll start us off. LAO is saying that is recommending that this committee reject the governor's proposal, limiting the legislature's discretion. Ms. Chu, could you try to give some examples of how limiting the legislature's discretion would not be in the public interest? Like say if there was a downturn in a significant downturn in revenues in the future, or can you come up with any kind of scenario that would best illustrate why it would be a bad idea?
Sure. So the legislature is the body of government that appropriates the funding and makes the decisions regarding how funding should be allocated and how the state should set its priorities with regards to funding. By automating the proportion of education spending that we have available to us, it effectively takes away a significant amount of the legislature's discretion to say, in a particular year, we want to dedicate additional revenues towards the career pathways or to other priorities the legislature may have, and simply automates much of the governing process that the legislature has with regards to budgeting for the state.
Mm-hmm. But I guess, depending on your opinion about the legislature, some people may welcome that and others may not. So I'm trying to, see if you can come up with like any specific scenario that would highlight why automating it would be such a bad idea.
Let me see if I can try to help out on that. Edgar Cabral with the LAO. I think one of the concerns we had is the sort of precision that the formula tries to provide with respect to the amount of LCFF funding from Prop 98. So in future years it would be 79%. Let's say you do hit a recession and you have to make cuts. What the formula is telling you that 79% of your cuts have to come from Prop 98 from LCFF. So if you wanted to make reductions in other areas. If you were to follow the statute, you'd have to make those reductions from LCFF. Now, you might want to, but we think you should. We think that you should reject this language because you should be able to make that decision if the situation comes up. Not that you should approve some language that is essentially directing you to tell you exactly how you're supposed to respond to a situation like this. You could also see a situation where you might want to dedicate more funding for LCFF or less funding for LCFF because there may be changes in other areas, and this formula is requiring you to stay to a very specific percentage. So I think that's part of the major concern that we have with tying this budget to something very specific. I would also point out that this discussion of it being a continuous appropriation is sort of a bit of a misnomer, because what a continuous appropriation is supposed to do is that if there is no budget, then automatically funding would be provided. And right now we already have that for the base ongoing for the prior year piece of LCFF. You can't make this isn't really a continuous appropriation because you still need to know what the Prop 98 number is before you can figure out what 79% of it is. So this isn't really creating any additional automatic appropriation that's sort of gonna occur without a budget process. This is still tied completely to the budget and tied to the Prop 98 funding level that is determined through the budget process. So it doesn't create any additional sort of continuous appropriation for school districts.
All right. Department of Finance, why does the governor want to limit the legislature's discretion?
Certainly that was not our intent in this proposal. The intent was to provide some additional certainty to the field during this time of implementation and with Common Core and several other unknowns or changes happening in the field today. So that certainly was our intent, and we would just note that the legislature could take action to change the percentages if a situation arose where that was necessary. I don't know if Chris has anything to add.
I think the one thing that I would add is from a contextual purpose, under revenue limits represented roughly 63% of Proposition 98. Under this proposal, LCFF the first year would be roughly 76%, with the vast majority of that difference being the former categorical programs now rolled into that continuous. So it's not a large overall percentage of Proposition 98 in terms of what we're proposing, but what it does is provide that certainty to the field. And I think we've heard from a few of the superintendents that from a budgeting perspective, that certainty is well received and well accepted. And a number of superintendents that we're hearing from support that concept.
But you heard from the LAO that with the guaranteed floor funding, with the guaranteed gap funding and the COLA funding, that there already is a substantial degree of certainty provided. Why lock ourselves into another, variation of ballot box budgeting?
While there is a level of certainty under the current continuous appropriation, this just increases that certainty for long-term budgeting purposes. So as districts begin to implement the LCFF and begin to transition, they're better able to position themselves for long-term planning. One great example of this is in the K-3 grade span adjustment. It will provide them with greater certainty to align their long-term plans as to how they'll make progress towards a 24-to-1 ratio in those grade spans, and they'll align that with the projections of Proposition 98 and the budget that go along with that.
Mr. Dababane.
Most of this discussion is occurring because of increased revenue to the state and a new budget that allows for greater increases in education funding. I just want to know, I guess, from finance, what would be the impact of this proposal if revenues were to decline significantly over the next few years, especially before full implementation of LCFF?
Sure. The way the language is written and what is intended to occur is that there would be a proration to the extent that Proposition 98 declines year over year. And that proration is intended to be against implementation funding that's been provided through the LCFF. I think one of the commitments that was made last year in enacting the local control funding formula was that no school district would receive less than they received in the 2012-13 fiscal year relative to then current fiscal law. So what we're attempting to do with our language is ensure that, yes, there may be a proration factor to the extent that Proposition 98 decreases year over year, but the impact of that proration would be against LCFF implementation funding.
Seeing no further questions, thank you very much. We'd like to invite up Kenneth Capon, the Legislative Analyst Office. Ms. Ramos, if you can stay with us, and Ed Hansen, Department of Finance. And let's, before we go any further, let's take this.
Mr. Marasucci? Chavez? Babne?
Here.
Estande? Ting?
Here.